Sexual expression and pleasure are fundamental aspects of being human, and when someone sustains a spinal cord injury, they often feel like those parts of their life are over. They bury their fears between mountains of limiting beliefs, and then they have questions that go unanswered because they're too afraid to ask them or even talk about them. If that's you, then listen up, because in this video, I'm going to answer some questions that I recently got from a subscriber all about sex. The things that she fears because she's newly injured are going to happen during sex, or the things that she fears she's not capable of doing during sex. All of the intimacy type things that most people with new injuries fear. So stay tuned. We are going to go through a bunch of questions that she had, and graciously she allowed me to compile all the questions she asked and make a YouTube video about it, because if she's curious about it, chances are other people are curious about it too. And I pride myself on this channel on making content that is kind of taboo. I was too scared to ask these questions to anybody. Even if it had been somebody that I felt comfortable around, I was just too embarrassed to ask them. So now I make a point of making content that, touches on the subjects that probably people are too afraid to talk about, and that they're definitely too afraid to ask questions about. So here we go. I am going to go through the questions that she had. So we'll start with number 1. Was the first kiss, second base, third base scary when you were dating? Obviously, the answer to this question is yes. All of that stuff was scary. I was newly injured. I didn't really feel comfortable with my bowel and bladder. I was, worried about things apart from being paralyzed as a teenager that were part of my body, like puberty and all that stuff. So my body was just, uncomfortable for me for a couple of years after I was paralyzed, just in general. And it had nothing to do with my paralysis. And then once I kind of got through puberty and stuff, and started experimenting with my boyfriend with, certain aspects of sexuality, nothing crazy. Of course I was scared. I was scared to pee my pants. I was scared that he was going to have questions about my body that I wasn't ready to answer. And I was also kind of naive, which was a blessing. As a teenager, there's so many things that I didn't really know about life and about intimacy in general. And so a lot of the time I just was like, I'm going to do this and hope nothing bad happens. Just like I said when I was going snowmobiling and got paralyzed. I still kind of had that mentality as a teenager. So I engaged in certain, intimate acts with my boyfriend when I was, 16, 17 years old. And just hoped I didn't pee my pants and hoped I didn't, embarrass myself in some way. But most of the time it turned out okay. And if I was ever uncomfortable, I was just like, oh, we got to stop. And he never really asked questions, which was really good. But obviously I was uncomfortable for all of that, because it's never comfortable, even if you're not paralyzed. And so having things that confound the issue, that, make it even more embarrassing, like bladder and bowel issues, of course I was afraid. But again, I just kind of was naive enough to jump through those hoops. I think as you get older in your life and you're paralyzed, then I think those things become even more worrisome, because the frontal cortex of your brain is developed, and so you do the risk analysis, and sometimes we overthink things too much. So I'm really thankful that I was paralyzed when I was a teenager. My brain wasn't fully developed yet, and I think a lot of the things that I tried, I probably had a level of naivety about, and it probably saved me from a lot of years of headache. Next question. Did you tell your boyfriend to let you know he was going to touch areas of your body that you couldn't feel? And how did you know that he was going to touch areas of your body that you couldn't feel, or was touching areas of your body that you couldn't feel, if he didn't tell you? So I'd never really thought about this before she asked this. Never once have I ever had somebody tell me that they were, give me a heads up, be like, hey, I'm gonna go down south. I never had anybody tell me that. But I've never not known that they were going down south, so to speak, because your part of your body, the part of your body that you can't feel, I equate to your hair. And there's never a time that somebody, unless they're you were sleeping or something and they were gently touching the bottom of your hair, that you wouldn't know that they weren't touching it. If they were grabbing it even gently like this, you'd know that they were touching your hair. So even though you're paralyzed, and a lot of us who are paralyzed can't feel below their level of injury, and they can't feel, their genitals, I can't feel anything in that area, I still know somebody's touching me there. So I thought that was kind of an odd question, and I'd never really given it any thought. But I do think that it's an important question. If you are somebody that wants to know for sure if somebody is going down south and you can't feel, just for like a comfort level and a trust thing, then you can just tell them, be like, hey, you know what? Don't touch areas of my body that I can't feel, especially in a sexual nature, without just giving me a heads up or asking me. Because I think that that's just, that's just respectful. If somebody asks you to give them a heads up, I think it's not a big deal. So if you want a heads up, then ask them to, give you a heads up. But if you're like me and you didn't really think about it, you're just sort of going with the flow, then it's usually not a big deal. So for me, I never have asked anybody to tell me when they were going, below my level of injury when they were touching me. But I've always known when they were below my level of injury, if that makes sense. If you don't feel much down there, do you just let your husband touch you for his own pleasure? I've had this question quite a few times, and the answer is no. I don't just let my husband touch me for his own pleasure. It is his, for his pleasure too, but it's also for my pleasure. And one of the things that I don't know whether I've like ever really thought about or really tried to articulate before was that I can kind of like imagine what the feeling is like for the things that are happening below my level of injury. There's an experiment out there where like you put your arm on one side of a sheet, and then there's like a prosthetic arm on the other side of the sheet, and then the researcher touches the prosthetic arm, and the person can feel it on their actual arm that is not actually being touched. And it's like an odd experiment that just sort of shows that your brain is capable of manufacturing things that it knows are happening. And I've talked to a few people that are paralyzed that this is like too. If they're looking at their leg and they see somebody touching it, they can feel it. But if they're not looking at their leg and they can't see somebody touching it, they can't feel it. And that's sort of what happens to me during intimacy. I can almost imagine what it's feeling like, which is a really odd thing to describe, but it's not like I don't enjoy the experience. So no, it's not just for my husband's pleasure. I get pleasure out of being touched, absolutely get pleasure out of being touched, and I would never not want, like to have intercourse or something just because I can't physically feel it. I don't think that just because you can't feel doesn't mean that you can't get pleasure from parts of your body that you can't feel, which is kind of odd. And that doesn't actually make sense when I'm saying it out loud, but it's the truth for me. I still get pleasure out of being touched on areas of my body that I can't feel. Next question. Since we don't orgasm, she was talking about the both of us because neither of us have had an orgasm post-injury. Do you just tell your husband, okay, that's enough, so that he knows when to stop having sex with you because we don't sort of finish? Well, I typically, in the situation with my husband and I, we typically finish when he has an orgasm, which doesn't bother me at all. And it's just sort of like how I've gotten used to interacting in intimate situations with the men that I've been with. So that's just sort of what I do. And I don't necessarily have like a disappointment or anything when we're finished because we sort of cuddle. And it's just sort of like the resolution for me is seeing him finish and take pleasure in my body, and then that's just sort of the end of it. But yeah, I don't think that there's any like rule out there about when to stop. Of course, I think you could keep going if it makes sense for you to keep going, if you still are getting some sort of pleasure after he orgasms and you want to keep going, keep going. If it's fine for you to stop when your partner orgasms and you don't need to orgasm, then it's fine too. So I don't really think too much about these things, and I don't think they're like as important as people maybe make them out to be when they're first paralyzed. So yes, I think you can tell them to stop if you want to stop, or you can keep going. It's really up to you in that situation. When you first became intimate with someone, did you wear pads, just pads, incontinence pads, which I wear now, or briefs / diapers? I've never really worn a diaper. I wore diapers for a little while in the hospital. And then I went from wearing diapers to wearing just underwear, which was very bold and brave of me when I was a teenager. My bladder was pretty ironclad back then. I didn't pee my pants a lot. But when I did, it was a lot of pee and it was really unexpected. So I, took a chance for, I think, a couple of years, maybe not even a couple of years. It was probably like a year. I didn't wear any incontinence products at all when I was like 14 to 15 kind of. And then I peed my pants in the middle of class once, and it went all over the floor, and I was so embarrassed. And so after that, I always wore incontinence pads in my underwear. And the question was, after this, there was a series of questions. How did you manage wearing incontinence products when you were planning to be intimate? Did you remove your pad or just let him touch it? Did you tell him, hey, I wear a pad, or just let him discover it when he touched you down there? And the answer to a lot of those questions is I don't really remember. I do kind of remember having a pad on and then having my boyfriend sort of go down south, and then me making some excuse about me getting my period soon. So just having the pad there as, like protection just in case, which he totally bought. And now that I've been married for so many years, it's never really an issue. My husband will just take my underwear off with the pad in it. It's no big deal. He knows I wear a pad. And when we're done, I ask him to get me a pad, which I affectionately refer to as a panty pad. And he goes and gets me one, and I put it back on. So it's not a big deal because he knows why I wear them. But in the beginning, I probably was really embarrassed about it. And I do recall a couple of times going to the bathroom, anticipating, that something might happen, and removing my pad so that it wasn't there. But I think that all starts with, a trust and honesty thing. And if you're just honest up front that you wear incontinence products, then they'll expect them when you guys go to be intimate. And if you are intimate before you've had that conversation, I think that's probably not a good idea, because then you're going to be afraid of having an accident during intimacy. And if it happens, they might not understand. So I just think being honest about what might happen, what could happen, and what realistically will happen in the future is so much easier than trying to pretend it doesn't happen and explaining it or apologizing for not being honest after the fact. So just be honest that you can have accidents, that you wear incontinence products as an insurance policy essentially, and that if they're going to be in your underwear. So that's just part of the declothing, and it's fine. But I'm also saying this from years of experience and being married for many years, so I totally get that it's kind of a privileged position to be speaking from, because I've already found somebody who doesn't care about that stuff. But I also think you will weed out the people who are not comfortable with that stuff. And that's a blessing. So if you're with somebody, you tell them, or you have an intimate experience and they're grossed out, then they're not the right one. So it's kind of a blessing, I think, to be able to weed out the garbage in the beginning. Not that people are garbage, but you know what I mean. People that are not right for you. Did you tell your first boyfriend what parts of your body that you could feel and could not feel? I've always been honest with everybody that I've ever been intimate with about what parts of my body I can feel and what I can't feel. And none of them has ever really cared. I feel like for men, like they're just looking for a warm, wet hole. And if you can provide that, it doesn't really matter too much to them whether you can feel it or not, especially if you find it pleasurable regardless. And I always have. So, yeah, that's my take on that. Okay, next question. Have you ever tried toys? Yes, I've tried sex toys a few times, and my husband and I don't really use them that often. I didn't ever try them before I was with my husband. And to be honest, it's not that like we don't want to use them or that I don't want to use them. It's just that we're busy and we have 2 kids and lots of stuff going on. So they just don't come out that often, because our kids are already grossed out when we have like regular sex, if they ever even get a hint that we're doing it. So, if we added in a bunch more things that would make the experience longer and more intense, they probably wouldn't appreciate it. So we do have them though, and we just don't use them very often. Next question. Since you can't feel your partner touching you, do you just act like it feels good and wait until he finishes? This is kind of the same answer as before about whether I allow my husband to touch me for his pleasure and not my own. I definitely get involved in the experience, and I'm not faking it when I'm showing signs of pleasure. So I'm not really sure what it's like for other women that are paralyzed and can't feel, but like I said, I do take pleasure in, intimate touching and intercourse and things like that. So I'm never ever faking it. Are there times that I might embellish a little bit? Sure, but there's everybody does that. I think that's like a normal thing when you want your partner to feel good, or just when you're trying to get in the mood, because sometimes you have to almost fake it till you make it, because not every single time you're going to be in the mood. And then once you start, getting into it, it comes along and you actually are in the mood. So I've never ever faked it. And obviously I've never faked an orgasm because my husband knows that I can't have one. So yeah, I'm never just pretending for his benefit. I'm always truthfully enjoying the experience. And I think that's something that you have to practice doing, is actually finding ways to participate in the experience. Fantasy and imagination are a big part of the sexual experience, for me at least. And so imagining things, fantasizing about things, different things that make me more excited, those are the things that help me get into the experience more. And I think everybody has to find those things for themselves. So yeah, work on that if you are worried that you're not actually going to sort of enjoy the experience when you're being intimate with somebody. But I don't know. I think everybody likes to be intimate with people, whether they can feel it or not. At least I do. So yeah, I've never faked it. Do you make your partner wash their hands before touching you? As somebody with a spinal cord injury, obviously, we have higher risk of UTI because we use a catheter, especially women, because our urethra is so close to our anus and there's lots of bad bacteria right around our vagina. And so there's a lot of things that can kind of get mushed around and increase our risk of UTI after intercourse, or any kind of playing around down there. So yes, I think it's appropriate for you to ask somebody to wash their hands. I don't typically, but my husband, he has clean hands. It's not like he's coming home from work and then, putting his hands down my pants. If that were the case, or we were camping or something and I knew that his hands were dirty, I'd probably ask him to wash his hands. But most of the time we've just gone to bed. My husband typically showers before bed, or it's in the morning and, there's not a whole lot of ways for your hands to get super dirty while you're sleeping. So, yeah, I don't typically ask my husband to wash his hands before we do anything. But there would be times that I would absolutely ask him to wash his hands if I thought that he was extra dirty. And then the last question, should I use lubricant to prevent skin irritation during intimacy? I've never actually had any problems with lubrication in that area, natural lubrication. I typically respond really well, even to imagining things. My body responds really appropriately to that in terms of lubricating where it's necessary and all of that stuff. So I've never had that problem, but I have heard of other women who are paralyzed that do have huge problems in terms of lubrication in their vaginal area. So I'm not really sure, what the answer is for you. You'll have to decide for yourself depending on what you've noticed after your injury. I do think that lubrication is absolutely a good choice if you struggle with lubrication. So definitely, make that call depending on how much lubrication you feel you need. But I also think that sometimes it's really hard to mimic the type of lubrication that would occur in a natural setting where you were actually getting in the mood. If you are actually getting in the mood and your body is releasing those hormones, then lubrication might not actually be an issue. It might just feel or seem like lubrication is an issue after your injury because you haven't kind of gotten back to that point where you're in the mood and you're feeling horny and you're you're wanting intimacy. And I think that that's an important part of the body's response, and the development of the lubrication in your vaginal area. So maybe experiment with your first few times, and the man that you're with or the guy you're with will let you know if you're not lubricated enough, I think. At least my husband always has. There have been a couple times where he suggested we use lube and it was no problem. So yeah, maybe experiment with getting in the mood first before you decide whether lubrication is necessary. All right, those are all the questions that I got from her about sex. Sex can be really scary after a spinal cord injury, and it is one of those things that can either, break you in terms of that part of your life, or it can be a really fun and exciting adventure that absolutely takes courage. to sort of embark on, but it's an adventure all the same. So it's not always going to go right. It's not always going to go right at all. There's going to be some really scary parts of it, and you're going to have some experiences that are embarrassing, but it's all worth it in the end. And the more that you trust your partner, the safer environment it's going to be. So I suggest that you first find somebody that you trust. And then the second thing that's super important in all of this is your mindset. It's really important to have somebody that you trust and that you feel safe around, but it's also really important to like sort of tackle the hurdles that you are creating in your mind about what you are able to achieve after your injury. And I think if you have really bad thoughts about your body and you have really bad thoughts about your ability to pleasure your partner, then you're probably going to have a really negative experience. If you are always thinking about having an accident or embarrassing yourself during sex, you're probably going to have a really negative experience. If you instead just be like, I'm not worrying about any of that stuff, I'm going to focus on the areas of my body that I can feel pleasure in, and you're going to focus on, you know, the imagination that you have that's in there that's, you know, so powerful, and the fantasies, you know, that you can create, and the love that you have for your partner, like all of these things that you can focus on that are so important to creating a positive experience. I think those are the things that you need to work on, you know, in order to have a good sex life. So having a partner that you trust is one thing, but also working on your own mental health is another important aspect. So make sure you do that. I think the most important thing that I've learned over the last 20 years since I've been sexually active and have a disability is that there is so much more to love and connection than just sex. And there's so much more to sex than just physical touch. So there is really no wrong answer in terms of how you can create a really healthy sex life. I think physical touch is just icing on the cake when it comes to a relationship. And there is way more than one way to ice a cake. So physical touch is great, but intimacy is so much more than that. So figure out how to ice your cake, try a few different ways, and really there's no wrong answer. It's really just about having fun. So go out there and practice and have patience and have some grace for yourself. But it takes courage. So I hope you have the courage to ask the questions, to be honest with the person that you love, and to just play around, because, you know, that's the fun part. So go play around with the person that you love. Find somebody you love and then play around with them. I would love to hear your answers to some of these questions. So if you want to take the time to answer some of them in the comments, that would be really awesome. I think the comments are such a fun place to share a bunch of different perspectives, and then when somebody comes to the video, they can sort of learn a lot from other people and not just me. So if you want to do that, I would appreciate it. Go take the time to just answer one or two of the questions that I talked about in this video in the comments. If you would like to see more videos about sex and intimacy with a disability, you can go and watch this video, which is all about sex positions after paralysis. And if you want to watch this video, it's a Q&A I did a few years ago about the most common questions that I get asked around sex and disability. Lastly, before I go, I want to remind you guys about my Patreon community. If you want to get early access to my videos completely ad-free, then you can go there and sign up for just $2 a month, and I would be so grateful if you would consider supporting me over on that platform. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will catch you back here on another video. Bye guys!